somewhere on the Rhine frontier late in the first century on the night before a cohort marched out toward a battlefield. A clay cup was passed down a long table, in silence. The wine inside was sour and watered, clouded with the milk of the opium, poppy bitter with the crushed root of the mandrake, dark with a resinous trace of hemp. The textbooks will tell you the Roman legionary fought on discipline and the sour ration wine governed by army, regulations sworn to the centurion and the standard. For 2,000 years that was the answer. A soldier, a cup, an iron life lived close to the edge of a sword. Then archaeobotany and ancient DNA reopened the case. Almost every part of the textbook story fell apart. The drink was not what we were told. The men were not who we were told, and their descendants are still walking modern Italy. To understand what the modern evidence overthrown, you have to first understand what the evidence was overturning. And that means going back to the battlefield record itself, the documented combat history of an army whose military reputation was, by the standards of the ancient Mediterranean, statistically impossible. In the summer of 102 BC, near the confluence of the Arc and the Rhone in southern Gaul, a force of roughly 32,000 Roman legionaries under Gaius Marius encountered the Teutones and Ambrones. The Germanic force numbered by the lowest ancient estimates more than 100,000 fighting men. The engagement that followed was not a defensive holding action. It was a Roman-led envelopment that broke the Germanic line and ended the migration as a military force in a single afternoon. The mathematics of the battle was that the legions should not have been able to do what they did. Aquae Sextia was not an outlier. The pattern repeated. At Vercelli the following year, at Alesia, in 52 BC, at Idis Diviso under Germanicus, in 16 AD. The legionary role was consistent. They were the heavy infantry deployed in disciplined lines, the soldiers who absorbed the first impact of an engagement and broke enemy formations by sustained close-quarter slaughter. They marched 20 Roman miles in 5 hours, under 60 pounds of equipment, then constructed a fortified camp by nightfall, then did it again the next day for weeks. They fought against numerically superior forces with documented success rates that no other medieval army matched, and the men who led them, the senior officers and commanders of the imperial period, lived into ages that the demography of the period made nearly inexplicable. Marius lived into his 70s, Sulla into his 60s, Augustus to 75, Tiberius to 77, Vespasian to 69, Trajan to 63. The average life expectancy for a man who survived to the age of 20 in the early imperial period was 48, the senior. Leadership of the Roman military and political establishment was outliving the demographic baseline by 20 years and more. And they were doing it under continuous campaign and governance stress in a disease-saturated environment that stretched from the Atlantic to Mesopotamia. The official explanation lived inside a small library of military manuals, the Epitome Re Militaris of Vegetius, the sixth book of Polybius on Roman military organization, the surviving fragments of the older republican drill regulations. The image that emerged from these documents and the image that survives in popular history is of the legionary as a creature of discipline trained on the Campus Martius, beaten by the centurion's vine staff into submission, whose endurance and combat record were attributed to the supposed virtue of his daily drill. The problem was that the manuals did not explain the chemistry. Discipline did not explain the wounds men took and kept fighting through. Something was being administered in the cup that the manuals did not record. The manual was the visible document. The question that modern researchers have spent the last several decades working through is what was actually in the cup. Most documented Roman drug use in the surviving sources is medical, but the medical pharmacopoeia and the battlefield pharmacopoeia drew from the same shelf, and the shelf was deep. The opium component is the most thoroughly documented. Papaver somniferum was cultivated across the Mediterranean throughout the classical period. Its seeds were eaten as food and pressed for oil, but it was the narcotic milk extracted from immature seed pods that gave the plant its critical role in ancient medicine. Galen, the most influential physician of the imperial period, prescribed opiated wine to Marcus Aurelius nightly, and the emperor drank a cup of it for years on his physician's advice. The cultural template was older. In the Odyssey, Helen slips what is almost certainly opium into the drinks of banqueting heroes to help them forget their sorrows. Roman doctors knew the drug eased pain, induced sleep, and killed at higher doses. They prescribed it accordingly, and the supply lines that fed the medical pharmacopoeia fed the army. The cannabis component has emerged more recently. Cannabis sativa was grown across the empire on industrial scale for rope, sailcloth, and durable clothing. But the resin of the female plant was physiologically active, and the Romans knew it. An ancient physician recorded that those who consumed hemp seed experienced confusion and a sensation of warmth. The recent excavation of a Roman woman who died in childbirth with cannabis resin recovered from her tomb confirmed that the resin was being administered internally for analgesia, not merely traded as a commercial fiber. The resin was on the shelf. Greater than the mandrake and henbane component is documented in the herbal tradition that the Roman pharmacopoeia inherited from the Greek. Greater than Pliny the Elder cataloged mandragora and hyoscyamus with their effects. Dioscorides, the army physician whose De Materia Medica became the standard reference for Mediterranean medicine for the next 15 centuries, recorded the dose and the method of preparation. Both plants produced dissociation and analgesia through tropane alkaloids. Both were routinely added to wine. The wine base was institutional, not the elite vintages of the senatorial table, but Pascha, the soldier's sour wine, ration vinegared and watered, distributed daily in the marching column. The base liquid was standardized, universal, and issued by the army. The cultural pipeline that carried this pharmacopoeia into legionary practices documented. Roman medicine integrated Greek, Egyptian, and Persian sources across centuries of Mediterranean expansion. The army inherited a drug shelf that was already centuries deep when the legions began their campaigns. The reconstruction has limits, and they are worth stating. No surviving Roman field manual writes down the formula. The recipe lives in the inference, not the text. But the inference is well anchored. A drink that combined a fermented base, an opioid analgesic, a cannabinoid, and a tropane dissociative would have produced a specific physiological profile. Modern toxicology can describe what the pharmacological case for the reconstructed preparation does not rest on speculation. Each of the principal ingredients has a clinical literature behind it. And when the documented effects are mapped against the documented combat record of the legions, the fit is item by item. The opium component is the most extensively studied. The active compounds in the poppy morphine and act on the mu opioid receptors of the central nervous system. The clinical literature is large and consistent. In significant doses, opium produces a measurable elevation of the pain threshold, suppression of the acute fear response associated with anticipated injury, and a dissociation between the sensation of pain and the emotional response to it. In a pre-modern combat context, on the eve of an engagement, the relevant outputs are specific. A man who had consumed opium in a moderate dose would feel pain less, react to it more slowly, and continue to fight a wound that an unmedicated man would have had to stop fighting to address. The cannabis component does something complementary. The active compounds tetrahydrocannabinol and cannabidiol act on the endocannabinoid system, a regulatory network present throughout the human body. Cannabis produces analgesic potentiation, suppression of the inflammatory response to tissue damage, and mild dissociation, working alongside the opioid rather than redundantly. The cannabinoid extended the duration of pain suppression and dampened the inflammatory cascade that would otherwise have incapacitated a wounded soldier within hours. The mandrake and henbane component contributed a third layer. The tropane alkaloids atropine and scopolamine produced vasodilation, mild euphoria at controlled dose, and suppression of the nausea and tremor that accompanied acute stress. The same chemical family that the Norse berserker evidence implicated generated through a different cultural pipeline, but with overlapping behavioral output. The Pascha itself contributed a profile. Dilute ethanol in moderate doses produces the well-documented anxiolytic effect that has made wine a feature of pre-combat ritual across most warrior cultures. The vinegar component carried antimicrobial action against the waterborne pathogens that destroyed armies as effectively as steel. The Roman army's documented low rate of dysentery on long campaign relative to the forces it engaged tracks with this. The base was hydrating, calorically dense, and chemically protective. The combined profile of the four components consumed in elevated dose before engagement produces a specific kind of soldier less reactive to pain, less prone to acute fear, more tolerant of the physical load of the marching day, better protected against the gut infections that destroyed pre-modern armies. The man who emerges is not a different species. He is an ordinary Italian peasant whose body has been continuously buffered against the conditions that killed his contemporaries. The combat record matched the chemistry. The disproportionate engagements at Aquae Sextiae and Alesia become less mysterious when the men in the line had elevated pain thresholds and suppressed fear responses. The manual said discipline. The cup was doing more than the manual described. The pharmacological case was strong. The next question was whether anything physical survived that proved the preparation had actually been administered. The evidence arrived from the ground. the tomb of a Roman woman who died in childbirth excavated in central Italy and reported in the peer-reviewed archaeological literature contained cannabis resin in a recoverable, datable chain of custody context. The resin had been administered internally, almost certainly for the pain of labor, and the find established that the cannabinoid was on the Roman pharmaceutical shelf in working clinical use, not merely traded as a commercial fiber. The broader pattern of residue analysis is older and larger. Opium alkaloids have been detected in residues from drinking and ritual vessels across the Mediterranean basin in contexts ranging from the imperial period back into the Bronze Age. The Minoan poppy goddess with her trance-like expression and her diadem of poppy heads was found near a tubular vase for inhaling opium smoke. The Mediterranean Drug Administration infrastructure predated Rome by 1,000 years and was inherited intact. The legionary infrastructure for medical distribution was institutional. The valetudinarium, the military hospital, was present at every major fortress from Vindolanda in northern Britain to Dura Europos on the Euphrates. The standard plan was identical across the empire, the rooms organized for triage and surgery and pharmaceutical storage. Standardized medical kits have been recovered from sites including Bingen on the Rhine and Rimini on the Adriatic, containing surgical instruments alongside containers with identifiable pharmaceutical residues. The army carried its pharmacy with it. The institutional wine ration is documented in the surviving administrative records. The Vindolanda tablets, the Egyptian papyri, and the various legionary supply records all show posca distributed by the librarius in measured quantities. The daily issue tied to the military calendar and the campaign timetable. The infrastructure for adding herbal preparations to a standardized wine ration at the legionary fortress level was administrative, not improvised. The viticultural footprint is the largest piece of physical evidence. The Roman army's documented role in expanding vine cultivation across Gaul, Iberia, the Rhineland and the Danube provinces reshaped the European wine economy. Wine became a logistical commodity at imperial scale because the army required it. The same institutional pattern that the Templar evidence revealed in southern France was operating 6 centuries earlier and on continental scale across the Roman frontier. The two-vessel distinction in Roman ritual practice is documented in the archaeological and textual record. The everyday cup and the potera, the ritual libation vessel reserved for prescribed religious occasions. The sacramentum, the military oath, was sworn over a libation that was not casual drinking. The architectural signature of a controlled administration practice was present in legionary life. The drink was prepared by the institution. The cup was issued by the institution. The wine was administered in the camp and the field, not at the soldier's discretion. The legion was a production line. For most of the modern era, the Roman legion had been treated in popular and scholarly writing as a category apart from the populations the empire ruled. The cives Romani were a hereditary category. The senatorial and equestrian families carried titles tracing back to specific Latin and Etruscan houses. The mythology of bloodline-based Romanness, surviving from Livy through Renaissance humanism into 19th and 20th century nationalism, treated the legionary as ethnically Italian, biologically continuous with the Latin stock that had founded the city on the Tiber. This was a theory built, like most pre-genetic claims about historical populations, in the absence of the evidence required to test it, and like most such theories, it did not survive the arrival of the evidence. The ancient DNA work on Roman period burials, including the major studies published in Science and the follow-on Mediterranean cemetery analyses across the late 2010s and early 2020s, has produced a different picture. Drawing on hundreds of sequenced individuals from cemeteries in and around Rome and across the Italian peninsula, the genetic record of the Roman period shows massive mixing across the imperial centuries. Roman-era populations carried significant ancestry contributions from across the Mediterranean and the Near East, with Anatolian Levantine and North African components flowing into the Italian gene pool throughout the Republic and the Empire. The mixing was real and is documented. The legion side of the picture is parallel. The legions were not a closed Italian formation. After Caracalla's Constitutio Antoniniana of 212 AD, every free male in the empire was a Roman citizen and eligible for legionary service. But the de facto recruitment of provincials had been continuous for centuries. Auxiliary units were drawn from Gaul, Germany, Iberia, the Balkans, Syria, and North Africa, granted citizenship on discharge. The skeletal record from legionary cemeteries at Vindolanda, Mainz, Carnuntum, and Dura Europos shows ancestry distributions that matched the broader provincial populations the men had been recruited from. They were not concentrated in any unusual ancestry cluster. They did not carry markers indicating descent from a separate Italian caste. They sat squarely within the mainstream genetic distributions of the regions that had supplied them. The implication was specific. The legionary was not a genetic outlier. He was not the product of a separate hereditary line maintained across the imperial centuries. He was a local provincial drawn from the population that farmed the Po Valley or the Iberian Meseta or the Gallic Civitates, and what set him apart from his neighbors was not his bloodline, but the institution that had claimed him. The capacity for the Legion's combat record was not in the genes, it was in the system that recruited him, fed him the cup, drilled him in the formations of the heavy infantry line, and deployed him on command across a continental theater. The legionary in this reading was not a hereditary warrior. He was a product. The transformation lived in the institution, not in the bloodline. This is the same finding that the ancient DNA work on the Norse berserker and the Templar burials produced. The warrior was a product, not a creature. The transformation lived in the institution, not in the bloodline. When the institution ended, the production line ended. But the men themselves did not end. Their genetic material did not end. The bodies that the empire had recruited from the Italian and provincial valleys and used in centuries of continental warfare were the bodies of local men, and when the empire receded, the men who survived went back to those valleys. Population-scale genetic studies of present-day Italian populations. Drawing on the regional biobanks and the multiple ancestry projects that have sequenced tens of thousands of modern Italian genomes, have established direct continuity between the imperial period populations of the peninsula and the modern populations of the same regions. The genetic distance between an imperial period inhabitant of Latium and a 21st century inhabitant of Latium is in most cases statistically negligible. The Y chromosome haplogroups documented in Roman period burials across the peninsula are present at high frequencies in modern Italian men. Specific lineages traced through ancient DNA have been matched to living descendants in the same regions where the legions were stationed and recruited. The framing here matters, and it is worth stating carefully. The persistence of Roman-era ancestry in modern Italy is not a claim that there is a Roman gene or that modern Italians carry some hereditary martial trait or that the descendants of legionary combatants are biologically different from anyone else. The legionary, like the Templar and the berserker, was a product of an institution. The institution required the legion, the sacramentum, the valetudinarium, the marching column, the standardized wine ration, the herbal pharmacopoeia, and the imperial infrastructure that linked Britain to Mesopotamia. None of those things are encoded in DNA. What is encoded in DNA is ancestry, and ancestry is a record of who fathered whom, not of what they did for a living. The continuity is documented and specific. Legionaries served 25-year terms and retired into coloniae across the empire. Many returned to their villages of origin. Many fathered children before, during, and after service with local women across the recruitment regions. The veteran settlements at Aquileia Mediolanum, Augusta Praetoria, and across the Italian peninsula seeded their genetic material into the populations that became modern Italians. The contrast with the cultural memory is striking. In Hollywood, in the popular imagination, in the entire post-Renaissance reconstruction of Roman identity, the legion is treated as a vanished thing. The empire fell. The legions were destroyed. The figure of the legionary is archaeological. The DNA tells a different story. The disappearance never happened. What ended was not a population. It was a practice. The vineyards still produce. The roads are still walked. The men who tend the modern Italian fields are the direct descendants of the men the empire recruited, used, and absorbed. The institution is gone. The men are not. Return to the field tent. The cup passed in silence the night before a cohort marched out toward a battlefield. Pascha in Italy. Pascha on the Rhine. Pascha on the Euphrates. The milk of the poppy clouding the surface of the wine. Mandrake root crushed bitter at the bottom of the cup. The resinous trace of hemp from a plant that the Mediterranean had cultivated for 1,000 years before the legions marched. The manual said discipline. The manual was the visible document. The textbook image of the legionary who fought sober on training and the centurion's vine staff was wrong. The drink was real. The pharmacology was specific. The institution that produced him was abolished in stages between the 3rd century and the fall of the Western Empire. The men who drank the cup died fathered children and were absorbed into the Italian and provincial populations the legions had drawn them from.